Jason Blake hauled the elderly woman into the courtroom like she was a criminal mastermind, though to anyone watching, it was painfully clear that Charlotte Hale, 68, slight and dignified, was no such thing. I was standing in the corridor when it happened. Along with half the town, it seemed. People stopped in their tracks, conversations fading into shocked murmurs. "Isn't that Officer Blake?" Someone whispered beside me. "Didn't he rough up a kid last week? What's he doing dragging an old lady around now?" I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. Blake's face was set in that hard, smug expression he always wore when he thought he was in the right, or when he didn't care if he wasn't. Charlotte, by contrast, moved with a quiet grace that felt almost defiant. Her hands were bound in front of her, but her posture was straight, her gaze steady. "This is unbelievable," a woman muttered nearby. "She's just a grandmother. What could she have done to deserve this?" Blake barked something about interference with an investigation as they passed me. His voice was sharp, carrying through the corridor like a gunshot. People stepped back instinctively, parting to let them through. I couldn't blame them. Jason Blake had a way of making you feel like you'd done something wrong just by existing. Charlotte didn't flinch. I don't know if she had nerves of steel or if she was just too tired to care, but either way, she held her head high as he shoved her into the courtroom. I followed. I had to see this play out. Inside, Blake wasted no time throwing his weight around. "Your Honor," he barked. "This woman interfered in an active police investigation. She needs to be held accountable." The judge, a no-nonsense type with a reputation for cutting through nonsense, frowned. "Mrs. Hale, is this true?" Charlotte didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, the officer is mistaken. I wasn't interfering. I was asking why he was unlawfully detaining my grandson, Malik. He was walking home from basketball practice, and Officer Blake decided that made him a suspect." The room went still. You could have heard a pin drop. Blake's jaw tightened. "The boy matched the description." "Of what?" Charlotte interrupted. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "Being black in a white neighborhood? Because that's the only thing he's guilty of." A ripple went through the courtroom. A few people murmured agreement. Others looked down, uncomfortable. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Officer Blake, is this true? Was there reasonable suspicion?" Blake stammered. "Your Honor." The boy refused to cooperate. "When I attempted to question him, Mrs. Hale stepped in and asked you for your badge number," Charlotte cut in, "which you refused to give. And when I said I was calling my grandson's parents, you shoved me aside and told me to stay out of it." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Did you shove her, officer?" Blake's face flushed red. She was obstructing justice. "No," Charlotte said, her voice rising just enough to cut through his excuses. "I was protecting my family. Something you wouldn't understand, officer." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Blake glared at her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but Charlotte didn't back down. The judge turned to the officer. "Officer Blake, I've received multiple complaints about your conduct. I'm ordering an internal investigation into this incident. In the meantime, Mrs. Hale, you're free to go." Blake looked like he'd been slapped. "Your Honor, this is..." "Enough, Officer Blake," the judge snapped. "Your behavior is under review." "Dismissed." The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. Blake stormed out, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Charlotte stood there for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she flexed her fingers. People in the gallery started clapping softly. Not everyone, but enough to send a clear message. As Charlotte walked out, her grandson Malik rushed up to her. "Grandma, are you okay?" She smiled, tired but unbroken. "I'm fine, Malik. We'll be fine." I watched them leave together, the boy's arm around his grandmother's shoulders. The murmurs in the corridor grew louder, but they walked through it all, heads high. Charlotte Hale wasn't just another victim of Jason Blake's aggression. She was a fighter, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the town was ready to fight with her. It started earlier that morning when Charlotte Hale stepped out of her modest apartment to get some air and stretch her legs. She loved mornings, the crisp air, the quiet hum of the world waking up. Strolling down Main Street, she noticed an elderly man patting his coat pockets frantically his face etched with worry. "Excuse me, sir," Charlotte said, stepping closer. "Is everything all right?" The man turned, his pale blue eyes wide with distress. "I think I lost my wallet," he admitted. "I had it when I left the coffee shop, but now it's gone. It has everything. My ID, my cards. I can't afford to lose it." Charlotte immediately began scanning the sidewalk. "Let's retrace your steps," she said kindly, gesturing toward the coffee shop he'd pointed to. Together, they searched near benches, planters, and corners where it might have slipped out. It wasn't long before Charlotte spotted the wallet lodged against the curb, half hidden by a pile of leaves. "Is this it?" she asked, holding it up. The man's face lit up with relief. "Yes, that's it." "Oh, thank you. You're a blessing." Charlotte smiled, brushing off his gratitude. "I'm just glad you've got it back." Victor Lane, as he introduced himself, insisted on walking with her for a bit. They chatted briefly before parting ways, but Charlotte felt a warm glow from the encounter. It wasn't until later, as she approached the bus stop near the courthouse, that her day took a darker turn. The first thing she noticed was Officer Jason Blake. He stood towering over a young black girl who couldn't have been older than 16, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The girl, who Charlotte would later learn was named Maya Brooks, looked terrified. She stood frozen as Blake loomed over her, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. "What's going on here?" Charlotte wondered aloud, quickening her pace. As she got closer, she caught snippets of Blake's accusations. "Loitering," he said. "You're hanging around here looking for trouble, aren't you?" Maya stammered. "I'm just waiting for the bus." Blake's voice sharpened. "Don't lie to me. You've been standing here for too long. What's in your bag? Drugs? Weapons?" Charlotte's blood boiled. The girl was clutching her bus pass in one hand, clearly just trying to explain herself. Charlotte had seen enough. She couldn't let this go on. "Officer Blake," she called out, her voice steady but loud enough to cut through the tension. "What seems to be the issue?" Blake turned to her, his expression souring instantly. "Stay out of this, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." Charlotte walked closer, ignoring his warning. "I'm making it my concern. This young lady is waiting for the bus, just like anyone else. Why are you interrogating her like she's committed a crime?" Blake's jaw clenched. "She's behaving suspiciously, hanging around, looking shifty." "Shifty?" Charlotte interrupted, her tone sharp. "Or is she just black in public?" Gasps from nearby pedestrians rippled through the air. A small crowd had begun to gather, watching the scene unfold. Blake's face darkened, his authority visibly challenged. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to back off," he said, his voice lower but no less menacing. "This is police business, and I'm asking you for an explanation," Charlotte shot back. "Why does waiting for a bus warrant this level of scrutiny? Do you harass every teenager at this stop, or just the ones who look like Maya?" The tension was palpable now. Blake stepped toward Charlotte, towering over her much as he had over Maya. "You're interfering with a lawful investigation." "Again." Charlotte didn't flinch. "And you're targeting people based on their skin color." "Again." The crowd murmured louder, a few voices even calling out words of support for Charlotte. Maya, still clutching her bus pass, glanced nervously between Charlotte and Blake. The girl looked like she wanted to disappear, but Charlotte wasn't about to let this go. Blake sneered. "You've got a lot of nerve, lady. Maybe you think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a busybody sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." "Justice belongs everywhere," Charlotte retorted. "And right now, it doesn't seem like you understand what that word means." Blake's hand hovered near his radio. "One more word, and I'll arrest you for obstruction." "Go ahead," Charlotte challenged, raising her voice so the crowd could hear. "Arrest me. Drag me into court again. Let everyone see how you treat a 68-year-old grandmother standing up for a teenager who's done nothing wrong. Let the whole world see the kind of man you are." Blake hesitated. The murmurs in the crowd were growing louder, shifting from shock to outrage. A man in the back shouted, "Leave her alone, Blake." Others nodded, their confidence bolstered by Charlotte's unshakable stand. Finally, Blake stepped back. "Fine," he spat. "But don't think this is over." He turned to Maya, his voice still gruff but less threatening. "Get out of here." Maya didn't move until Charlotte gently touched her shoulder. "It's all right," Charlotte said softly. "Go ahead and catch your bus." The girl nodded quickly, her eyes wide with gratitude, and hurried onto the bus that had just pulled up. As it pulled away, the crowd began to disperse, but not without casting more disapproving looks at Blake. When Blake was finally out of earshot, a woman approached Charlotte. "That was incredible," she said. "You're so brave." Charlotte shook her head. "It's not about bravery. It's about doing what's right." As she continued toward the courthouse, Charlotte knew she'd likely face more backlash, but she didn't care. People like Jason Blake could only hold power if no one stood up to them. And as long as she could stand, she'd make sure to fight for those who couldn't. Blake's patience snapped like a brittle twig. His jaw tightened as he grabbed Charlotte's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "That's it," he barked, his voice echoing across the street. "You want to interfere? Now you'll answer for your actions." Charlotte didn't resist as Blake yanked her toward the courthouse. She winced at the force he used, but her face remained calm, her chin held high. The murmurs from onlookers followed them like a shadow. Some reached for their phones, recording the spectacle, while others simply watched in disbelief. "Is that Jason Blake again?" someone muttered. "Does he ever back down?" Another voice, sharper, said, "He's out of control. Look at her. What could she have done?" Blake ignored the whispers, storming into the courthouse with Charlotte in tow. The grand wooden doors slammed shut behind them, silencing the crowd outside. Inside the courtroom, the buzz of anticipation was almost tangible. It was one of those moments when everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the explosion they knew was coming. Blake wasted no time. He marched Charlotte up to the front, his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor," he barked, standing rigidly before the judge. "I'm charging this woman with obstruction of justice, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest." The judge, a seasoned woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her papers. Her expression barely concealed her irritation. "Officer Blake," she said, her tone clipped. "What exactly is going on here?" Blake puffed out his chest, his voice dripping with self-righteousness. "This woman has repeatedly interfered with police matters. Earlier today, she disrupted an investigation and refused to comply when asked to step away." Charlotte stood beside him, her posture composed despite the visible red marks on her arm where Blake had gripped her. She didn't interrupt as Blake continued, piling on accusations with increasing fervor. "She's a habitual troublemaker," Blake added. "This kind of behavior cannot be tolerated." The judge's gaze shifted to Charlotte. "Mrs. Hale, is this true?" Charlotte's voice was steady, though the fire in her eyes burned brightly. "Your Honor, I intervened because Officer Blake was harassing a teenager at a bus stop. Maya Brooks was doing nothing more than waiting for her ride when he accused her of suspicious behavior." Blake scoffed. "She matched a description." "A description of what?" Charlotte snapped, her voice rising. "Another innocent black person minding their business?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A few people nodded in agreement. Others whispered to each other, their faces a mixture of shock and unease. "Order," the judge said, rapping her gavel sharply. "Mrs. Hale, continue." Charlotte's eyes never left the judge's. "This is not about justice, Your Honor. This is about Officer Blake abusing his authority to target vulnerable members of our community. And when I dared to speak up, he decided to silence me, just as he's silenced others before." Blake's face turned crimson. "Your Honor, this woman is twisting the facts." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "I've heard enough for now. Mrs. Hale, do you have witnesses who can corroborate your version of events?" Charlotte nodded. "There were several people at the bus stop who saw what happened, and I believe some of them recorded it." A ripple of movement ran through the gallery as a man in the back stood up. "Your Honor, I saw it." Officer Blake was out of line. Another voice chimed in. "Me too. He was harassing that girl for no reason." The tension in the room grew thicker. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly shaken. The judge looked unimpressed. "Officer Blake," she said, her tone icy, "I've received multiple complaints about your conduct in recent months. This incident is beginning to sound like a pattern. Do you have evidence to support your claims against Mrs. Hale? Blake hesitated, his bravado crumbling. I was just doing my job, he muttered, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. Charlotte didn't miss a beat. If doing your job means targeting teenagers and silencing those who stand up for them, then perhaps you should reconsider your career. The murmurs swelled again, louder this time. Many in the room recognized Charlotte as a pillar of the community, a woman who had spent years advocating for justice and equality. Her reputation preceded her, and it stood in stark contrast to Blake's increasingly tarnished image. The judge leaned back in her chair, her gaze cutting through the room like a blade. Mrs. Hale, you're free to go while I review this case further. Officer Blake, consider yourself on administrative leave, pending a formal investigation into your actions. Blake's jaw dropped. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Enough, the judge snapped. I will not tolerate further outbursts. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and the room erupted. Blake stormed out, his face a storm cloud of rage and humiliation. Charlotte stood for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. Then she turned, her head held high, and walked toward the gallery. Victor Lane, the elderly man whose wallet she'd found earlier, was among those waiting. Mrs. Hale, he said, his voice filled with admiration. You've got more courage than most people half your age. Charlotte smiled faintly. It's not about courage, Mr. Lane. It's about doing what's right. As she stepped outside, she was met with applause from a small crowd that had gathered, many of them holding their phones, capturing the moment. Charlotte nodded at them, her expression resolute. Maya Brooks, now standing with her parents, approached her cautiously. Thank you, the teenager said softly. Charlotte placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. Don't thank me. Just promise me you'll keep standing up for yourself. People like Blake only win when we stop fighting. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy lingered. Charlotte Hale had made her stand, and it was clear to everyone watching. This was just the beginning. Later that evening, Ethan Brooks paced his small but cluttered home office. His desk was covered with notebooks, newspaper clippings, and printed documents, all tied to his investigation into systemic police misconduct in the city. He had been working on the story for months, meticulously gathering evidence and interviews. Still, the pieces felt like they weren't enough, until now. The phone call from his daughter, Maya, had changed everything. When she recounted the events of that morning, her voice trembling as she described Officer Blake's harassment and Charlotte Hale's courageous stand, Ethan's journalist instincts kicked into overdrive. You mean to tell me, he said, gripping the phone tightly, that Jason Blake, the same officer I've been investigating, publicly accused you of suspicious behavior while you were just waiting for a bus? Yes, Dad, Maya said quietly. He called me shifty and demanded to search my bag. If Mrs. Hale hadn't stepped in, Ethan's chest tightened. Anger simmered just beneath the surface of his calm voice. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. That should never have happened to you. Maya hesitated. Dad, you're going to write about this, aren't you? I don't just want to write about it, Maya, Ethan said. I want to expose everything. Blake, the misconduct, the whole broken system. Ethan wasted no time. He arranged to meet Charlotte the next morning at a local diner, bringing his tape recorder and notepad. When she arrived, she was already familiar with his work. Charlotte was a voracious reader of the local news and had followed his previous exposés. Mr. Brooks, she greeted, her handshake firm. I'm glad you reached out. I've been waiting for someone like you to take this on. Please call me Ethan, he said. And I'm the one who should thank you. You stood up for my daughter when no one else would. Charlotte waved off the compliment. Standing up is the easy part. It's what comes after that gets messy. Ethan nodded, switching on his recorder. Let's start from the beginning. I need everything. Blake's behavior, the courtroom, the crowd's reaction. Charlotte dove into the details, her account as vivid as if it had happened moments ago. She described Blake's aggression, his baseless accusations against Maya, and the humiliation she herself endured as he dragged her into court. Ethan listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking clarifying questions. As the conversation unfolded, Charlotte brought up other incidents she had witnessed. Stories of Blake intimidating teenagers, roughing up suspects without cause, and silencing dissenters with threats of arrest. And the worst part, Charlotte said, her voice tinged with frustration, is that the people who could stop him don't seem to care. They just turn a blind eye. Ethan leaned forward. Not anymore. If they won't hold him accountable, I will. By the end of the meeting, Ethan had enough material to begin assembling his story. But he knew it wasn't enough to rely on Charlotte's testimony alone. He needed to find more people willing to speak out, more evidence to prove that Blake's behavior wasn't just an isolated case but part of a larger pattern of systemic abuse. Over the next week, Ethan dug deeper. He tracked down witnesses from the bus stop, several of whom had recorded the incident on their phones. The footage was damning. It showed Blake towering over Maya, his posture aggressive and his hand near his gun, while the teenager stood frozen in fear. The video also captured Charlotte stepping in, her calm yet firm voice cutting through Blake's bluster. Ethan also uncovered a string of complaints filed against Blake over the years, many of which had mysteriously gone unresolved. One particularly chilling case involved a young man who claimed Blake had beaten him during a routine traffic stop. The man's injuries were documented in hospital records, but the police department had dismissed the case, citing lack of evidence. As Ethan's investigation gained momentum, the tension in the city grew. Word spread quickly about his upcoming exposé, and it wasn't long before people started contacting him directly. Parents shared stories of their children being targeted, community leaders spoke of being ignored by the department, and former officers admitted to witnessing misconduct but fearing retaliation if they spoke out. Meanwhile, Blake's reputation continued to unravel. The footage from Maya's incident circulated online, sparking outrage on social media. Calls for his suspension grew louder, with hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #AccountabilityForBlake trending citywide. The pressure reached a boiling point when Ethan published his article. Titled "A Pattern of Abuse: The Untouchable Officer Blake," the piece was a masterclass in investigative journalism. It laid out years of evidence, testimonies from victims and witnesses, and damning footage that painted a clear picture of a man who had abused his badge and a system that had allowed it. The article didn't just expose Blake. It implicated the entire police department. Ethan highlighted the culture of silence and complicity that had protected officers like Blake, calling for sweeping reforms to hold them accountable. The fallout was immediate. The mayor called for an independent investigation into the department, and the police chief was forced to hold a press conference, where he announced that Blake had been placed on unpaid leave pending further review. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice not just for Maya but for every victim of police misconduct. Charlotte, for her part, remained steadfast. She attended the protests, standing shoulder to shoulder with others who had suffered under Blake's tyranny. When asked by a reporter why she continued to fight, she replied, "Because silence is complicity. And I won't be complicit in my own oppression." Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with both pride and determination. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about changing the city for the better. And as he saw Charlotte, Victor Lane, and even Maya standing together in solidarity, he knew they were just getting started. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. The hearing was already the talk of the city, with Charlotte Hale at its center. She stood tall, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the simmering tension in the room. Officer Jason Blake, seated at the prosecution table, exuded his usual arrogance, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as he glanced at Charlotte. Judge Ruth Caldwell, a seasoned jurist known for her incisive questioning, presided over the case. Her reputation for dismantling flimsy arguments was legendary, and as she entered the room, the low murmur of the crowd hushed into silence. "Mrs. Hale," Judge Caldwell began, adjusting her glasses, "you've been charged with obstruction of justice, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. You may now address the court." Charlotte nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." She stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Before I address the allegations against me, I'd like to provide some context." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather case, opening it to reveal a gold badge. The room collectively inhaled as the light caught its surface. "My name is Charlotte Hale, and I am a former federal prosecutor," she announced. For over 25 years, I specialized in investigating corruption and abuse of power, including within law enforcement. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. People exchanged stunned glances, and even Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow. Charlotte continued, undeterred by the murmurs. My intervention at the bus stop was not an act of defiance or disorder. It was an attempt to protect the rights of a teenager, Maya Brooks, who was being unreasonably harassed by Officer Blake. I saw no evidence of criminal activity, only a young girl waiting for her bus. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier confidence began to waver, and beads of sweat formed on his brow. He had not anticipated this development, nor the calculated precision with which Charlotte presented her case. "Officer Blake," Judge Caldwell said, her tone sharp, "you've accused Mrs. Hale of obstruction. Provide this court with a detailed account of her actions at the bus stop." Blake stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I observed Maya Brooks exhibiting suspicious behavior. She appeared to be loitering." "Loitering?" Charlotte interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Is it standard practice to accuse someone of criminal intent for standing at a bus stop?" "Mrs. Hale," the judge warned, though there was no mistaking the hint of approval in her eyes. "You'll have your chance to cross-examine." "Continue, officer." Blake hesitated, visibly flustered. She was acting nervous, fidgeting with her bag. "I asked to see its contents, and Mrs. Hale interfered, preventing me from doing my job." Charlotte raised an eyebrow, waiting for the judge's signal to speak. When it came, she stepped forward. "Officer Blake, can you explain why you believe Maya Brooks was a threat? Did you find drugs? Weapons? Anything illegal in her possession?" Blake faltered. "No, but—" "So you detained a minor, publicly humiliated her, and accused her of suspicious behavior without any evidence of wrongdoing?" Blake's face reddened. She matched a description from a recent call. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "A description? Just a convenient excuse. Because when I asked for details, you provided none. Instead, you escalated the situation by threatening me with arrest." Judge Caldwell leaned forward. "Officer Blake, what was the exact description you were working from? And why did it warrant such aggressive action?" Blake's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It was vague," he admitted finally. "A young black individual, possibly carrying a bag." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Someone from the gallery muttered, "So basically any black kid with a backpack?" The judge pounded her gavel, silencing the crowd. "Enough," Judge Caldwell barked. She turned her gaze on Blake, her expression icy. "Officer Blake, I expect more precision from an officer of the law. Vague descriptions are not grounds for targeting innocent citizens." Charlotte seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, this is exactly the pattern I've seen throughout my career. Broad, racially biased assumptions leading to the harassment and victimization of innocent people. If I hadn't stepped in, who knows how far Officer Blake might have taken things." The weight of Charlotte's words hung heavily in the room. Ethan Brooks, seated in the gallery, scribbled furiously in his notebook. His story was practically writing itself, bolstered by every damning admission from Blake. Maya sat beside her father, gripping his hand tightly. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't just from fear or humiliation. For the first time, she felt seen. Her voice echoed in the courageous words of someone standing up for her. Blake's attorney attempted to redirect the narrative, but the damage was done. With every evasive answer and flimsy justification, Blake's credibility crumbled further. By the end of the hearing, Judge Caldwell had heard enough. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice steady but firm, "the charges against you are baseless. You are free to go." Charlotte exhaled softly, her calm exterior barely betraying her relief. The gallery erupted into applause, and even the gavel couldn't immediately silence the crowd. "As for you, Officer Blake," the judge continued, "this court will recommend an independent review of your conduct. Until then, you are suspended from duty." Blake slumped into his seat, his confidence shattered. The humiliation was palpable, and the whispers from the gallery only added to his disgrace. As Charlotte left the courthouse, she was greeted by a throng of supporters. Ethan approached her, his notepad tucked under one arm. "Mrs. Hale," he said, offering a handshake. I can't thank you enough for standing up for my daughter. Charlotte smiled. The fight isn't over yet, Mr. Brooks. But together, we can make sure it's one they won't forget. With Maya and Ethan by her side, and the growing support of the community, Charlotte knew the battle for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was already on edge, the tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air. Just as Judge Caldwell prepared to move forward with her ruling, the doors swung open, and Ethan Brooks entered, clutching a folder stuffed with documents. All eyes turned to him as he strode purposefully to the bench. Your Honor, Ethan said, his voice ringing with urgency, I have evidence relevant to this case. These documents show a disturbing pattern of misconduct by Officer Blake, including multiple violations of citizens' rights over the years. The judge frowned, but gestured for him to proceed. Ethan handed the folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. These records, Ethan continued, include complaints filed by victims, internal memos showing attempts to bury investigations, and even footage from body cameras that was never disclosed. This isn't just about Mrs. Hale's case. This is about a systemic issue centered on one officer abusing his authority. Blake's face drained of color as Ethan spoke. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of shock and anger. Judge Caldwell rapped her gavel sharply, silencing the crowd. I will review this evidence, the judge announced, her voice firm. This court is in recess for 30 minutes. As the judge left the bench, the tension in the room reached its peak. Blake sat rigidly, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He avoided eye contact with anyone, especially Charlotte, who stood calmly, her eyes fixed ahead. Ethan returned to sit beside his daughter, Maya, who clutched his arm tightly. Dad, she whispered, do you think it'll make a difference? Ethan looked at her, his jaw set. It has to, he replied. The minutes dragged on, every tick of the clock amplifying the suspense. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, people exchanging opinions and outrage. Victor Lane, the elderly man Charlotte had helped earlier that week, leaned over to a fellow spectator. If this doesn't take him down, nothing will, he said quietly. Finally, Judge Caldwell returned, her face unreadable as she shuffled through the papers on her desk. The courtroom fell silent. After reviewing the evidence presented by Mr. Brooks, she began, her voice steady. This court finds that there is significant reason to doubt the legitimacy of the charges against Mrs. Hale. Therefore, all charges against her are hereby dropped. The gallery erupted in applause, and the judge allowed a moment before raising her hand for silence. Furthermore, she continued, her gaze now fixed on Blake, I am ordering an official investigation into Officer Blake's actions, both in this case and the many complaints filed against him. Officer Blake, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. Blake slumped in his seat, his face a mask of humiliation. It was as if the authority he had carried so arrogantly had evaporated in an instant. Mrs. Hale, the judge said, turning her attention to Charlotte, I owe you an apology. Your actions were not only justified but commendable. It is citizens like you who remind us of the importance of holding those in power accountable. This court recognizes your courage. Charlotte nodded, her composure unshaken, though a glimmer of satisfaction flickered in her eyes. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, headlines blared across the city. Corrupt officer exposed. Citizen courage sparks change. Ethan's investigative work took center stage, with his detailed exposé about Blake's misconduct circulating online and in print. The footage of Maya's harassment and Charlotte's intervention became a symbol of resistance, rallying citizens to demand systemic reforms. Blake's downfall was swift and brutal. His name became synonymous with abuse of power, his suspension just the beginning of what promised to be a career-ending investigation. Protests erupted outside the police department, fueled by a collective outrage that had been simmering for years. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Maya found themselves at the heart of a growing movement. People from all walks of life reached out to them, sharing their own stories of injustice and thanking them for their bravery. For Charlotte, the victory was only the beginning. She saw an opportunity to turn her fight into something lasting. Sitting down with Ethan, Maya, and a group of community leaders, she outlined her plan. We need more than outrage, she said. We need action. A platform for people who've been wronged and resources to help them fight back. I want to start a non-governmental organization focused on exposing and addressing abuses of power. Ethan nodded. Count me in. I'll use my platform to amplify your work. Over the next few weeks, Charlotte worked tirelessly to build her vision. She partnered with journalists like Ethan, human rights defenders, and civic activists. The organization, named Justice First, quickly gained traction, becoming a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless against the system. The day of the official announcement for Justice First arrived, drawing a crowd outside the courthouse where it had all begun. Charlotte stood at the steps, flanked by Maya, Ethan, and Victor Lane, as she addressed the gathering. This is not just about one officer or one case, she said, her voice strong. This is about every person who's ever felt silenced, ignored, or targeted because of who they are. Our fight is for justice, for accountability, and for a system that works for everyone. The applause was thunderous. People held signs with messages like, "Thank you, Charlotte," and "Courage inspires change." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Charlotte to shake her hand, to thank her, to share their stories. A woman with tears in her eyes said, "You gave us hope." A young man added, "You made us believe things can change." Charlotte felt a swell of emotion. There was still so much to be done, but standing there, surrounded by people ready to fight alongside her, she knew this was just the beginning. She turned to Maya and Ethan. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Maya smiled. "Good thing we're just getting started." Together, they walked down the courthouse steps, ready to face whatever came next.